I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Howard Bloom, celebrated author and music publicist in the 1970s and 80s, described as a star maker whose client list was a who's who of rock and roll. In addition to his remarkable music industry career, he's also a very well known author with six major titles to date on topics ranging from capitalism and socio-cultural evolution to his personal memoirs of the 60s. So, Howard, let me start out by asking, as I understand your career, you actually started out focused on science, but ended up going on a different path and got into the music industry working as an editor for a rock magazine. I'm wondering what made you leap? What made you take that leap, I guess?
Um, I was not just interested in science. I was a science person through and through. When I was 10 years old, absolutely no other kids wanted to have anything to do with me in my hometown of Buffalo, New York. My parents didn't seem to want to have anything to do with me. They were very, very busy and didn't have time for me, and they didn't show any joy when they showed up and took a look at me. So there I was, a very lonely kid, and one day in my family's living room, a book appeared in my lap. I don't know what it was. I don't know where it was from. And it said the first two rules of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it gave the example of Galileo. And it told the story that Galileo would have been willing to go to the stake for his truth. And it took me 30 years to find out that wasn't true. Galileo actually was friends with the Pope, cut a deal with the Pope, said everything he'd ever written had been wrong, and got 9 years of house arrest. But I
Ah,
needed the heroic false version of the story as an example of courage. And rule number two of science, it said, is look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look for things that you and everybody around you take for granted and are invisible to you, and bring them into visibility, and then proceed from there. It gave the example of Anton von Leeuwenhoek, the inventor of the microscope. Um, so all of a sudden, I had companions, and companions who could not say no to me, who could not literally move their ball game to a different ball field in the hope that I wouldn't find them if they saw me coming up the street, which is what the kids in Buffalo, New York did. And these two guys couldn't reject me for a very simple reason: they were dead. Um, so I started reading 2 books a day, one book under the desk at school, and another book when I got home. And in the course of the next 2 years, I was taken seriously as a scientific person. By the time I was 12, I had built my first Boolean algebra machine. I had co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards. And I had been taken for a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at the University of Buffalo, my hometown university. And I would imagine, if you imagine yourself, you're the head of the graduate physics department, and some woman brings a 12-year-old in to talk to you. How interested are you going to be in that conversation? Well, I
yeah.
would imagine he must have scheduled 5 minutes for me just to placate my mother. And instead, we were in his office for an hour because we were arguing the hottest topic of the day, which was Big Bang versus steady state cosmologies, theories of the universe, and the interpretation of the Doppler shift, which made all the difference to which of those theories was going to come out ahead. And he came out of his office and put his hand on my shoulder and towered over me and said, "You don't have to stay for grad school for him. He'll get fellowships at any school he wants." He's talking about graduate theoretical physics. And my mom was kind enough to set me up for individual tutoring sessions with the head of research and development for a company called the Moog Valve Corporation. Well, the Moog Valve Corporation made super advanced valves for the engines of 2 airplanes, the Bell X-1 and the Bell X-2. The Bell X-1, if I've got this correct, was the first plane to break the sound barrier, and the Bell X-2 was the first plane to make it to the edge of space.
Ah,
And by the time I was 16, I was working at the world's largest cancer research lab. And instead of paying attention to advanced immunology, which was what I was supposed to be doing, I was puzzling out something called the CPT problem in theoretical physics, the charge, parity, and time problem. If matter and antimatter are created in equal amounts at the same time, where's all the antimatter? Simply that. And by the end of the summer, I had a solution, and the solution predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for another 38 years: dark energy. So science was my life. But when I was 12 years old, I realized I was an atheist. I couldn't confess it, Tim, because if I did, I'd blow my bar mitzvah. And my bar mitzvah was going to be the first party I was actually invited to with other kids, and it was also going to mean presents. So I put that realization aside, kept it out of my speaking mind, had my bar mitzvah, spent 2 months, that was in June, spent 2 months writing thank you notes, and then at the end of August, I could confess that I was an atheist. Now, something strange happens in the Jewish calendar in September, just a few weeks after this realization. It's called the High Holidays. It's Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And my parents were not observant. They only went to the temple when there was a wedding or a bar mitzvah. But when it came to the High Holidays, they took those really seriously. So they got me into a suit. I don't know how, because I hate suits. They got me into their car. They got me all the way to Richmond Avenue, which is where the synagogue was, and then they tried to remove me from the car, and I refused to go. So there I was, holding on to the door frame of the sturdily made blue Fraser four-door automobile, and my parents were literally tugging at my ankles, trying to drag me up the sidewalk to the synagogue. And something occurred to me. I'm an atheist, so there are no gods in the sky, and there are no gods under the earth. But there are gods in this picture. Where are they? They're in my parents, in this absolute passion to take their firstborn son and drag him, if necessary, to the synagogue over the abrasion of the pavement. And if those gods are inside my parents, they're inside of me. Now, Galileo had accomplished what he had accomplished by taking a brand new instrument that had been devised so that you could look at the horizon and see the troops of the enemy coming far earlier than the enemy realizes. It was called a spyglass. And instead of using that spyglass horizontally, he used it vertically and looked at the sky, which was an outrageous idea because everybody knew what was in the sky. It was perfect circles, because circles were perfect according to Aristotle, and it was God's underwear. How dare you peer up God's underwear, for God's sakes? And Anton von Leeuwenhoek made his advances by taking a lens he used for horizontal viewing. He was a draper. He imported fabrics, and he used a lens to see the fineness of the weave. And instead of looking horizontally, he turned that lens down and looked at pond water and discovered it was filled with what he called animalcules, microorganisms. So I suddenly realized my job is to take the lens and turn it inward, to find the gods inside. And I became fascinated with the ecstatic experience and how the ecstatic experience relates to the forces of history. So when I was 14, now I'd been on the trail of the ecstatic experience and the gods inside for 2 years, and I heard of the existence of a book called The Varieties of the Religious Experience. And from that title, it sounded to me like I was not alone. So I was desperate to get a copy of that book. Now, Buffalo's not a book-rich city. It's not an intellectual town. At least it wasn't when I was living there. It was all steel workers. So it took me 4 months to track down a copy of the book. And it felt as if William James, the author of that book, who wrote it in 1902, had laid out a series of these extraordinary, ecstatic experiences on a lab bench in Petri dishes and said to me personally, look, I don't have the tools to understand these things in 1902. But when you come along in 1950, that would have been 1957, you will have tools I never had. And I am leaving you these mysteries as a legacy. So I've been in pursuit of these things ever since. Now, when it came time to go to grad school, the head of the graduate physics department was absolutely right. I got 4 different grad school fellowships. I graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa. And I got 4 graduate school fellowships, except what I was interested in now was something that didn't have a name. It actually was called physiological psychology back then, but nobody had a program in it. And now we call it neuroscience. And I realized that grad school was going to be Auschwitz for the mind. Here I was interested in the ecstatic experience, the gods inside, and how the ecstatic experience shapes the forces of history. And how close was I going to get to the ecstatic experience giving paper and pencil tests to 20 college students in exchange for a psychology credit? I was going to get nowhere. I would be totally divorced for the rest of my life from that which interested me as a scientific thinker the most, and as a human. Because after all, science is about the aspiration to omniscience. And that means every bit of human experience, no matter how strange, including the illusion of UFOs, is something we need to understand. And we need to do it in two ways. My friend Robin Fox has a phrase. Robin Fox is the founder of the anthropology department at Rutgers University and a really towering anthropologist. And Robin Fox talks about anthropology as being participant observer science. In other words, I wanted to both experience those ecstasies and I wanted to explain them. There was one thing that William James had said that was very important. He said, all of these experiences that I'm describing to you are what we would call psychopathological. But in the hands of the right person, a psychopathology can be an engine of history. So I needed to go, look, and meantime, in my junior year at NYU, I didn't major in science because I'd spent my whole life in science. By the time I got to NYU when I was 21 years old, I'd spent more than 50% of my life in science. But when I was 12, a strange thing had happened to me. A girl in my class had actually looked at me. I was in 8th grade. It was the very first time that had happened to him. And then she did something even stranger. She made eye contact, which was a shock to me because I had never experienced it before in my life. And she said, I told my mom you understand the theory of relativity. This is when I was 12. Okay. And because the kids, the only recognition I had from the kids was that they called me the sickly scientist. They knew my total immersion in science. So I didn't dare confess that I didn't understand the theory of relativity. And as soon as school was out, I jumped on my bicycle and I rode the 2 miles to my local library, where the librarians literally knew me better than my mother did. And I said, give me everything you've got on relativity. And they gave me 2 books, a great big fat book by Einstein and 2 collaborators, and a little skinny book by Einstein himself. So I got home, and I had learned at the age of 12 that do the hardest thing first. If there's a book that you feel you absolutely cannot understand, if you read it from cover to cover, by the time you finish, whether you know it or not, you will have understood something. So I started with a big fat book, which is all mathematical equations. It had 7 words of English on each page. That was it. And by 8 o'clock that night, I'd only gotten up to page 50. And I realized, okay, my mom is going to put me to sleep at 10 o'clock tonight. That's 2 hours from now. And if I haven't understood the theory of relativity, I'm going to be humiliated tomorrow morning in school. So I picked up the little skinny book, and again, it was as if Albert Einstein had reached out through the pages, grabbed me by the lapels, put his nose up to mine, and said, schmuck, listen up. If you want to be a genius, it is not enough to come up with a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then explain it so clearly that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. So Albert Einstein, through the pages of a book, had told me point blank, you want to be an original scientific thinker, you have to be a writer. And not just any writer, you have to be a fabulous, a delicious writer. A writer whose work people cannot put down. So when I went to college, to NYU, I majored in English literature, thinking that they were going to stand over me with a whip for 4 years and turn me into a writer, make me write. That turned out to be wrong. English literature is about how many times the word yellow appears in a work by Chaucer. It's not at all about teaching you how to write. But there I was, majoring in English literature, minoring in psychology, and but I loved poetry. Poetry had been extremely central to my life, and I was writing it. Well, the poet in residence at NYU thought I would be the next great poet to come out of NYU. And in my junior year, he said, Bloom, I got to talk to you. wait until everybody else leaves the room, and close the door and sit. This did not sound good, Tim.
Okay. Yeah.
So I waited until everybody left the room, and I closed the door, and I sat in the bawling out seat. And he said, look, you, last year I asked you to be on the staff of the literary magazine. You never even showed up. This year I'm telling you, you are the literary magazine. You are the literary magazine's editor. You don't even have a faculty advisor. Once you walk out of that door, you are it. Now get the hell out of that door. So I walked out of that door looking extremely distressed because I hated literary magazines. They are so boring, it's ridiculous. The typeface on the cover is terrible. The blue that they use for the cover picture is enough to stop an orgy. And so I really looked distressed. And a kid coming down the corridor said, you look disturbed about something. Can I help you? And I said, yes, I've just been made the editor of the literary magazine. And he said, why don't you come downstairs with me for a cup of coffee? Now, remember, I didn't grow up with other kids. I didn't grow up with humans. I had laboratory rats, guinea pigs, and guppies in my bedroom. And so I didn't know human rituals, and I really didn't know what having a cup of coffee was. I'd never done it before. So we went down to a coffee shop, and he ordered coffee, and I ordered a glass of water. And he asked me one of the most important questions of my life. If you could do anything you wanted with this magazine, what would it be? And I said, it would be a picture book. And he said, fine, you've got your answer. So I gathered a staff of artists, some of whom were not legitimate NYU students, but were astonishingly talented. And we put out the first issue of the magazine, and it was a smashing, incredible hit. I was called into the student activities office. I thought I was going to be balled out there too. Frankly, I didn't know there was a student activities office. And they said, your magazine was absolutely gorgeous. We're doubling your budget. Tim, can you imagine anybody ever calling you in for a meeting to tell you they're doubling your budget?
Yeah, that's amazing. That's amazing.
Right.
And so with this magazine, then, with this approach, I guess actually you've probably mentioned 10 or 15 influences where I'm saying, God, this pushes him towards rock and roll, which is interesting. The ecstatic experience.
All of it pushes me toward rock and roll. So here I was with my 4 graduate fellowships, and it was the beginning of the summer, and I'd tried to kill myself at the end of the school when school was over, because for 4 years I'd had a purpose in life, every single day, getting straight A's, which I'd done for 3 years straight. And all of a sudden I had no purpose in my life, and was a very depressive person. I spent the first 60 years of my life in clinical depression, meaning depression every minute, every second of every day. And after I tried to kill myself, I hadn't gotten myself a job, and I walked in to the apartment of my most talented artist. And he, his wife, and his baby were sitting on a wall-to-wall rug with no furniture in the room, crying. And I said, why are you crying? And he said, well, our electricity is about to be turned off, our telephone is about to be turned off, and we're being evicted from our apartment. The reason we have no furniture is all of our furniture has been repossessed. And I said, you're a fucking genius. Your work is brilliant. Why don't I take your work out for 2 weeks, and I'll get you enough work to pay your rent, and then I can find a summer job. And he said, well, you can't do that unless you also take out the work of the person I came to New York with, because our plan has always been to have a studio of our own. Well, I knew the work of that other artist. It was terrible. It was awful. It wasn't art. But I said, okay. I mean, this is a guy who needs to be saved. He's got to pay his rent. And at the end of the summer, I hadn't sold anything. And I had gotten New York Magazine interested in doing an article on us, quite by accident. That's not what I was trying to do, but they were interested. But I hadn't gotten anywhere. And I'm an obsessive compulsive person, and I realized 2 things. First, I'm not finished with this. Second, this allows me to go into something I've never been allowed in my life. I grew up with Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartók, and Stravinsky. And this allowed me to get a periscope position on popular culture. And if I was going to find the land where the gods are, it was going to be in popular culture. If I was going to find the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made, the stuff that really interested me as a science person, as a participant observer science person, who wants to fully steep himself in the experience and then to be able to understand it scientifically, then this is it. So I called Columbia, where I was supposed to be going to grad school, and said I lied, which is terrible, because remember, my basic rule was the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And I said I had a backpack problem, and we set off the following year. And then I continued with this art studio, and that's how I got into, actually, it's how I got into the music business, because it took, for the first year, we each earned $75 a piece. Can you imagine that?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we were on the verge of starvation. But then I invented an animation technique, a new animation technique for NBC TV. I made it on the cover of Art Direction magazine, in a picture by by the artist who had been crying on the floor with his wife and his child. It's a terrific picture. And ABC, the big corporation, owned 7 radio stations. And there was something new that had come out of a conference at Bard College, this really avant-garde, super creative place. And it was called progressive radio. And up until that point, all radio was top 40 radio. They played the 40 biggest hits in the country. And they focused on the top 20, really. They got very boring. And the idea behind progressive radio is you let a DJ loose and you let him play anything he wants. If he wants to play an entire album from beginning to end, he can do that. If he wants to play an album cut that's nowhere near a hit, most people are not familiar with, he can do that too. So ABC was about to take this enormous gamble, taking all of its 7 stations and converting them to this untried radio format. And who did they hire to do all of their graphics? My studio, which meant I had to go up to ABC frequently. They actually asked me to found an ad agency to handle all of their advertising, but I didn't want to learn whatever it's called, rate buying or something like that, time buying. It just sounded boring. I wasn't going to learn anything from it. And so I didn't do that, but we continued to do all of their graphics. And the head of promotion was very sweet to me, and she was schooling me on rock and roll. And then one day she said, we're having a concert at Studio B up here in our office complex, and if I give you 2 tickets, will you come? So I said yes, and I brought my brilliant artist who'd been weeping on the floor. Peter Bramley was his name, and we sat there, and there was a piano player on stage. Well, we didn't sit there. The piano player was on stage, and Peter embarrassed the bejesus out of me because he stood on his feet almost the entire concert. He was yelping, he was yowling, he was whistling, he was clapping, and I wanted to make sure that nobody thought he was with me. I shriveled in my seat. Well, the piano player on stage's name was Elton John, and over the course of time, I would learn that what Peter had done had helped make the quality of that performance, because an artist lives on the energy that he gets from the audience. And that concert was so remarkable that it turned into Elton John's, it turned into a live Elton John album. And you can hear that Elton John album to this very day. And Peter had helped make it what it was. So there I was in the land of rock and roll. And I could go on, but I should probably give you the opportunity to ask a question if you have one.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I mean, it's overwhelmingly amazing. And again, yeah, I realize you're I mean, a self-avowed atheist, but then listening to this story, it's as if the universe or higher power guided you towards this, right? So
yes, in a certain way, and it's hard to describe. I still remain a stone-cold atheist, looking for the gods inside, so some people call me a material mystic. But what happened is this. I knew that to live the Einstein imperative, my next step, I had already written I'd written for the head of the Middlesex County Mental Health Clinic. So I'd written up the results of conferences and all kinds of things for him. And he wanted me to co-write a book with him, but I wanted to go back to school, so I couldn't do that. Then, after my freshman year of college, I wanted to find a writing job. I went through the New York Times. I looked for every employment agency that advertised editorial openings. There were 98 of them. I went through the first 97, and I got turndowns. And I got to the 98th. I mean, this is the end, right? You've had 97 turndowns. What's going to happen with the 98th? Obviously the same thing. And they said, can you come in? We think we've got something for you. And it was a job with the Boy Scouts of America, a writing, and well, actually it was supposed to be a proofreading job. So I went out to, now first of all, you have to realize, when I was 11 years old, I was thrown out of the Boy Scouts for incompetence at Morse code. And if they hadn't thrown me out for incompetence at Morse code, they could have thrown me out for incompetence at knot tying. But I have never in my life heard of any other human who's been thrown out of the Boy Scouts. Any.
Yeah.
So sending me to work for the Boy Scouts of America at their North American headquarters in New Brunswick, New Jersey, how ridiculous can you get? Well, they put me to work for one day with a bunch of grad students, people much older, kids much older than I was, proofreading. And at the end of the day, they decided to make me an editor and writer. How's that? I mean, that's fast advancement. And they gave me my first editing and writing job. They handed me the Boy Scout Handbook chapter on masturbation, which had been obviously written in the 1930s or 1940s, because it said if you masturbate, a long black hair, 3 feet long, will come out of the middle of your left palm, and your eyeballs will fall out. And in the 1960s, these were no longer convincing arguments.
Yeah.
So they gave me no sense of direction on what they wanted at all. They just said, give us a modern chapter. So I based the chapter on don't do it because it'll make you feel guilty. And they loved it. So then they gave me their handbooks on stalking and tracking and camouflage. And again, they gave me no sense of direction. They just said, update these. And I discovered that if I can't find my way into the woods, much less out of them. I'm incompetent at woodsy stuff.
Yeah.
But I discovered if you love your audience, and I did, and you do enough research, you can serve that audience. And I was serious. I wanted those kids that were reading that stalking and tracking handbook to be able to get close enough to a bunny rabbit that it didn't know they were there until they were rubbing noses with it. And I was serious. One day on my way to the Boy Scout headquarters from the bus terminal in New Brunswick, there was a rabbit in a field, and I dropped down on all fours and started to approach it using all the techniques that I had learned writing this book.
Okay.
This handbook. So, and this would become very important in my career in rock and roll for a very simple reason. I wanted to live out the Einstein imperative. I felt the next move was to write for magazines. I had no idea of how I would get into magazines at all, but I was buying clothes from a designer on the Lower East Side whose clothes were unlike anything you've ever seen before, and I was co-designing some of the clothes with her. So I walked into the office of an underground fashion magazine one day with my portfolio, intent on putting the portfolio down on the desk and showing it to the women who were the staff of this magazine. And as soon as I got out of the elevator, their jaws dropped. All they saw was what I was wearing. And they said, do you have more of these? And I said, yes, I've got a whole closet full of them. Why? And they said, do you think you could write an article about these? Well, damn, Albert Einstein was there in the back of my brain telling me to write for magazines, and now I was being asked to write for a magazine. So I ended up becoming a contributing editor to this magazine called Rags, and contributing 175 articles.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Then another one of the contributing editors said, I'm starting a new magazine called Natural Lifestyles. could you be a contributing editor? And I said yes. Okay, another thing was happening at that point. A guy named Matty Simmons had co-created something called the credit card for American Express, and he had made a fortune. And now that he had a fortune, he wanted to be a publisher. So there was a magazine that a bunch of kids at Harvard used to crank out once a year, and it would sell out on newsstands all over America in 2 hours. So Matty flew up to Boston and got together with two of the kids who had cranked out this magazine and said, look, instead of doing this once a year, why don't you come to New York? I will put you up in luxury. I will give you really startlingly great salaries. And why don't you turn out this magazine once a month? And the magazine the Harvard kids have been cranking out was called The Lampoon. So the new magazine that Matty put together with these two kids was called The National Lampoon.
Yes.
And they needed art direction. Now, Matty treated me as if I were a son. He was wonderful to me. And I had this one artist who was staggeringly good, the artist who had done all the work for ABC. And I had this artist who I thought was horrible and wasn't an artist at all, that Peter Bramley had blackmailed me into including in the studio. So Matty gave us the job of art directing the National Lampoon, which meant a whopping big check every single month. And the artist, who was incompetent as far as I was concerned, who was not an artist, went to the group and said, look, we're getting this whoppingly big check every month. Why do we have to give Howard a percentage? If we kicked Howard out, we could take that percentage for ourselves. And what he was really after was not just that. He was after taking over control of the National Lampoon's art direction. And he was truly terrible. And the first 7 issues of the National Lampoon, from a graphic and visual point of view, are appalling. Absolutely appalling. And they lost the account. And they all went back to being starving artists and drinking themselves to death.
Okay.
So, which is really unfortunate because these were very talented people. And meantime, I was out of the art studio, and one day I was covering a parapsychology convention for natural lifestyles, because with my science background, they love to put me on pseudoscience stories. And everywhere I went, I had a pad in my left hand and a pen in my right, because I was constantly taking notes. And a kid spotted me busy taking notes and walked up to me at the parapsychology convention in the middle of all of these people talking about bending spoons with your mind, and said, would you like to edit a magazine? Now, in order to write those 175 articles, I had gotten up in the morning at 6 o'clock, gone directly to the typewriter without a stitch on. It was a big Remington manual typewriter, so pounding the keys was a difficult process. And I had pounded the keys until 8 o'clock in the morning writing. Then I had gone to the art studio, done my bit to establish it at an ever higher level, and come back home. And from 8 o'clock at night until 11 o'clock at night, I had written with a pot of coffee next to me. And I was getting very tired of that. So I thought, if I edit a magazine, then I can write during the day. And I won't have to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I said yes. And he set me up for a meeting with the publisher of the magazine. And in those days, Tim, we didn't have Google.
So
you couldn't simply feed a person's name into your computer. We didn't have those either. And find out who you were going to talk to and what in the world the name of the magazine is and what it was about. So I walked into the meeting not knowing anything. And the magazine turned out to be Circus. And I thought, okay, clowns and elephants. I can do that. No, it wasn't about clowns and elephants. It was about rock and roll. It was at the time, I think, it was one of the 3 biggest rock monthlies in North America. And that's how I got into rock and roll. And then I went to my first concert, a Fleetwood Mac concert. And when we all walked into Carnegie Hall, we were all self-conscious as hell. All of us were noticing the people on either side of us and the people behind us and trying to look cool. And then the lights went down, and the lights went on the stage. The lights, the audience lights went down. And slowly we lost that sense of individual self-consciousness. And slowly we merged as a common thing, and we're focused totally on the stage. Okay, now I have to remind me I was at the Fleetwood Mac concert to tell you another story. So when I was 16 years old, I had been on the track of The Gods Inside for 4 years. And I was not popular at my school at all. Nobody really wanted to have anything to do with me. But there were a bunch of functional committees. And when it came time to elect people who could actually run these committees, they didn't care whether they liked you or not. They simply elected you if they thought you could do the job. So I was elected for 2 years in a row to the head of what was called the programming committee. We had 5 school assemblies a week, one at the beginning of each day, 45-minute assemblies. As head of the programming committee, it was my job to program 2 of those committees a week, and it was my job to MC 5 of those programs a week. And for the first 2 months, I was terrified. I had stage fright, going in front of an audience of 350 people, and then it became as normal as breathing. One day, the juniors came to me, and they said, "We're having a dance." Now, Kim, you have to realize something. If there's a dance anywhere in Buffalo, New York, my hometown, I am cordially invited to stay as far away as possible, preferably Cleveland or Albuquerque. And these kids were asking me if I could advertise their dance for them. I, the person who would never be allowed in a dance. Now, my parents, every 2 years, would try to turn me into a normal kid. And one year, their grand effort had been to send me to dancing school. And in dancing school for a year, it became very obvious I could not master the box step. I could not master the waltz. I could not master the foxtrot. I could not master any of the dances of the day. I was more than incompetent at dancing. But to advertise this dance, I put a record on a turntable behind the stage, and I went on the stage and danced. And when I danced, it probably looked like a Looney Tune drawn on a day when Chuck Jones, who drew the Looney Tunes, was on LSD. It was the craziest thing you've ever seen in your life. And something really weird happened. I saw the faces of the audience melt. I saw the face of the girl who hated me the most go totally flaccid, and her eyes grow wider and wider and wider. And I had an out-of-body experience. I felt like I was on the ceiling watching this whole thing from above. And I saw the audience, the energy of these 350 people congeal as if it was one big amoebic blob. And I saw that big amoebic blob reach a pseudopod out to me like a tunnel and send all of its energy through me. And I saw that energy go to someplace around my head, become utterly transmogrified, and flow back to that audience at high speed through me as if I were an empty pipe. And that reverberatory loop, that feedback circuit, just kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger.
So that's the ecstatic experience then, right? That you were talking about earlier. That
yeah,
sounds like, yeah.
Exactly. That was the ecstatic experience. And when the whole thing was over, the audience did something that it did with such precision that it looked like it had practiced it all its life, but it had never done it before. And it would never do it again. It didn't do it for homecoming queens. It didn't do it for football heroes. It didn't do it for anybody. The audience surged to the foot of the stage, picked me up on their shoulders, carried me outside of the auditorium and up the hill to the building where we had our classes, and then finally put me down. It was extraordinary.
Yeah. So just spiritual, really. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like it was just a spiritual, I don't know what you call it, like a culmination
it's
experience.
one of those varieties of the religious experience that William James was talking about. And certainly being seized and taken over by the gods inside, absolutely. So I was at a Fleetwood Mac concert. I felt our faces melting the way the faces had melted in the audience to me. I felt our energy being channeled toward the stage the way it had been channeled to me. And then something happened. So the electricity on the stage went out, all of it. There was no sound, there was no lighting. And the lighting on the audience went up. And the magic of a concert was about to be broken. And Mick Fleetwood, this is before Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks joined the group, when it looked like Fleetwood Mac was on its last legs, was a blues band about to disappear the way its leading competitor, Chicken Shack, would disappear. And Mick Fleetwood, the 6'7" string bean of a man, walked down to the very lip of the proscenium and raised his fist in the air. And he said, "Fuck it. We are going to rock and roll." And he galvanized us, absolutely galvanized us. And we were more of a common force, linked together, sending our energy through him and through the performers on that stage than we ever would have been without this catastrophe, without having a common obstacle to overcome. And if you want to see the science on what a common obstacle does to unify a group, look at the work of Muzaffar Sharif, which is all about it. And I suddenly realized, by accident, I have landed in the land where the gods are. So that's how I got into rock and roll.
And it's absolutely amazing. I mean, and so I mean, that was the beginning of one of the most amazing music industry careers. So you've done PR and management strategy for, again, this is a who's who of rock and roll: Prince, Billy Joel, Styx, Michael Jackson, Cyndi Lauper, the Talking Heads, Lionel Richie, ZZ Top, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Simon and Garfunkel, John Mellencamp, and then Earth, Wind and Fire, and actually Kiss. Can't forget Kiss. So
Kiss, Queen, Run DMC. Wait, I'm leaving somebody out. Kiss, Queen, Aerosmith, Run DMC, AC/DC. If I left them off, yeah, it just went on and on and on. Kool and the Gang. The list is very long.
Now, what's interesting, though, and this comes out of the science part of it. So the former president of Atlantic Records suggested, he said that you're interested in rock and roll had to do more with the study of mass psychology and action. And again, this goes to the ecstatic experience in Gods Within, than in furthering the aggrandizement of spoiled rock stars. But he'd indicated that you approached PR as an applied science, which really everything that you've said.
It was a participant observer science, which means it was my obligation to go through, it's what I wanted more than anything else, was to go through the ecstatic experience the audiences went through and to understand my artists, because I had had the ecstatic experience that they went through. And let's go back to Circus Magazine for a second. So the publisher, Circus Magazine, showed me two European magazines that sold 1 million copies each. And he pointed out that the biggest selling rock magazine in North America, Rolling Stone, sold 250,000 copies, which was simply not comparative with 1 million copies at all. Plus, these two magazines, one in Germany and one in France, were selling in markets that were a fifth the size of the United States. So it was as if they were selling 5 million copies compared to the pittance that Rolling Stone was selling. And the magazine that Jerry Rothberg hired me for, Circus Magazine, sold 60,000 copies. So Jerry showed me these magazines, and he said, I want to achieve what these two magazines achieve, and I want the magazine to read like Time. Now, I had read Time magazine from cover to cover since my freshman year of high school. And my best friend and I always tied for winners as in the Time magazine annual current events quiz. And since Time magazine only gave one prize to each school, the figures that be at our school had to figure out how they were going to handle the fact that the two of us had tied, and they decided to give no prize whatsoever. But I knew Time magazine backwards and forwards. So I spent the next year working the way that I tend to work, 17-hour days, 7 days a week, no vacations. And I analyzed. I took Time magazine, Salut les copains, the French magazine, and Bravo, the German magazine, apart as if they were frogs on a laboratory table, and I were dissecting them with a scalpel. And at the end of the year, the first year, I came to my publisher and I said, look, if you give me the sales figures on the magazine so that I can do some simple correlational studies, I guarantee you that I will increase their sales. And he really, really was reluctant. He had never divulged those figures to anyone before, but he gave them to me. And I worked out the correlational studies, and I said, okay, here's what we're going to do. You have a policy. You cover a band only once a year. You don't want to bore people. Well, I have discovered in analyzing these magazines that we must have an A track, a B track, and a C track. In Time magazine, the A track is the president. You cover him every single issue, and you cover him as an unfolding soap opera, so people can't wait to see what's going to happen next.
Okay.
You have a B track. At that point, it was Henry Kissinger. People who appear every other issue. And then you have a D track of people you're trying out to see if your audience is interested in them at all. Plus, Celui de Copain has a ballot in each issue, and it has a top 20. And if you buy the magazine, you can clip out the ballot and send it in, and you can do your best to make sure that your favorite band makes it into the top 20. I want that ballot so that I can measure every single month exactly who our audience is interested in. And Jerry gave me a go-ahead to do it. Do you know what happened in the next 12 months? We increased in circulation 211%.
Yeah, amazing.
In 12 months. And at one point, a few years later, Chet Flippo, who was one of the founding editors of Rolling Stone, among other things, he founded their East Coast office, sent me by messenger a great big manila envelope. Now, it's not usual for mere writers to be using messengers. It's very expensive. And I opened the envelope, and there were 6 typewritten pages in it. And the 6 typewritten pages were about some little guy working in a converted broom closet who was turning straw into gold. And he said that this person had invented an entirely new magazine genre, the heavy metal magazine. And guess why he sent those 6 pages to me? Because I was the person he was describing. So I've been credited in Chet Flippo's graduate school thesis, because he got his graduate degree while he was doing his work with Rolling Stone. It was a history of rock journalism, as being the inventor of the heavy metal magazine, a whole new genre. And that actually was true, because eventually Jerry came to me, my publisher, and he said, don't you think it's about time that you got a raise? Well, I'd never worked for anybody before, and I didn't know the norms. I had forgotten that such a thing as raises exist. And I said, okay, that sounds reasonable. He said, what do you want? And I said, well, give me some time to do some research. Now, the editors for whom I worked at Rags had all gone on to work at Vogue. One had gone on to co-found a magazine with Gloria Steinem called Ms. They were all in high-placed positions. They were brilliant women. So I called all of them, and I said, how much should I ask for? And they said I was earning $10,000 at that point, which is the equivalent of about $60,000 now. And they said, well, tell me what you do. Now, one thing I didn't tell you, when I walked in for my meeting with Jerry Rothberg, there was this office on the left where Jerry Rothberg was ensconced with 7 windows overlooking the East River. And there was a converted broom closet in which 2 editors were packing up their stuff and leaving. So I had replaced 2 editors. So I described what I was doing, and they said, you should ask for a 60% increase. So I went to Jerry, and I asked for a 60% increase, and Jerry said, no, I can't afford it. And I don't know what motivated me, but I understood that out of pride, to keep from being humiliated, I was going to have to quit. So I gave Jerry 6 months' notice. And I found a brilliant writer and started training him for 6 months as my replacement. And I spent an hour every day in another closet, writing a 57-page booklet on how to turn out Circus Magazine, the formula. And then I left and got into PR, which is a story we'll get into in a minute. But Jerry eventually, he was doing so well with my formula that he was able to hire 5 people to replace me.
Oh,
can you imagine that? I had been doing the work of either 2 people or 5 people, depending on how you calculate it.
Yeah.
And then a year later, Jerry abandoned the formula, and I felt jilted. I was really hurt. And I got a call from Barry Kramer, who was the founder of a magazine called Cream, asking if we could have lunch. So when we had lunch, I gave him the formula. And then I got a call from Shelton Ivany, who was the editor of a magazine called Hit Parader, asking if he could pick my brain, and we had lunch. And I told him the formula, and it became a genre. That's why Chet Filippo was able to call it a new magazine genre. So at any rate, when I gave Jerry Rothberg 6 months' notice, I went out looking for a job. And because I don't dress in a normal manner at all, my wife and I went to Barney's to try to get me normal clothes. And somehow we ended up getting me these cuffed, baggy, plaid pants, like a clown suit. Don't ask me what was going on in our minds. I have no idea. And so I went looking for a job, and I was having a hard time finding a job. I mean, there was a new magazine getting started where the 2 editors wanted me as a co-editor, and then they sent me to their publisher. And the publisher, they were women, so I got along with them fabulously. This was a man. I hadn't yet learned that you have to show submission gestures to somebody who thinks he's in charge. You can't use dominance gestures, and I had used dominance gestures with the 2 female editors, and I just repeated what I had said to them, to their boss, and it did not go over well at all. So I didn't get that job. And then Steve Gaines, the talented writer that I was training to be editor of Circus, said, there's somebody that I want you to meet. And he introduced me to Seymour Stein, the founder of Dire Records, the man who would eventually discover Madonna. And Seymour's record label was distributed by Gulf and Western, which distributed 14 record companies at that point. Gulf and Western was the biggest conglomerate in the world. And Seymour said, look, why don't you found from scratch a public and artist relations department for Gulf and Western's 14 record companies, and then you'll be my publicist. And I said yes. And that's how I got into music publicity.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack here, but it's amazing. And now you've also written several books as well. So again, this is, I mean, you have a diverse.
I've written 7 at this point, and my new one has just come out, and it's called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me: A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll, and it's my rock and roll memoirs. And I wasn't free to write it until now for a simple reason. In 1988, after doing all the things you've talked about, the PR for all these major superstars, I became extremely sick. And nobody knew what it was. The doctors had no idea what it was. But I had to walk into my office one day and say, I'm leaving in 2 weeks. I could be dying. I have no idea what I've got. And I'm giving you the business. And the next day, I got a call from one of my competitors on the West Coast offering me $350,000 for the company, which is the equivalent of about $1 million today. And I said, no, I gave the company to my staff yesterday. And I'm truth at any price, including the price of your life. I'm a man of my word.
Yeah.
So, and I spent the next 15 years in bed. And I was too weak to speak for 5 of those years, too weak to have another person in the room with me. But I used the internet. I had to reinvent myself as a human on the internet. I lost my sense of humanity entirely. And I founded 2 international scientific groups, and I wrote 3 books. And my dilemma was this. I'm a science person. That's my base. My base isn't rock and roll. My base isn't publicity, science. But I was going to have to regain my scientific credibility because as a publicist, you are really sneered at. And as a rock and roll person in science, you are really sneered at. I mean, this, for me, the rock and roll experience was my voyage of the Beagle. Rock and roll was my Galapagos Island. In other words, it was what Darwin, what the voyage of the Beagle, which is a 5-year voyage around the coast of South America, had been for Charles Darwin. But nobody in science was going to understand it. It was just too far off the wall for anybody in science to understand what I had done and why I had done it. So I was going to have to reestablish my scientific credentials. So, sounds like a nice dog.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, so at any rate, by 2 years ago, I had either published or given lectures at scholarly conferences in 12 different fields: quantum physics, cosmology, I can never remember all 12 of them at once, but evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, information science, governance, and aerospace, among other things. So I felt I had gone far enough in reestablishing my scientific credentials and was finally free to write my rock and roll memoirs. And that's what Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me is. And the response from people has been ecstatic, absolutely ecstatic to the book.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I'll be getting a copy of that as well. And I've been reading through how I accidentally started the 60s. And so that was earlier, right? And what grabbed me was right near the beginning, you had talked about, and I'd almost thought this too, you'd mentioned, Ken Casey and
right.
Yeah. And so that, when I always looked at that, I've seen the footage of it. They turned, I believe, Ken Casey's the bus tour into a movie. And so I saw I saw
amazing.
that. And to see yours, but that wasn't, what you were doing wasn't beatnik though, right? Beats were the 50s. So
the beats were the 50s. And when I was 16, well, look, I was reading Time magazine from cover to cover. Time magazine was written for advertising executives living in New Canaan, Connecticut, who have to take the train into New York City every day. And it's written so they have something to read on the way into New York. And it's written so they know exactly what they should be talking about to sound smart that week. And it's also written with an escapist piece. And the escapist piece, to indulge people's sexual fantasies, was about the beatniks. So every single week they covered the beatniks. Isn't this terrible? They're having free love. Well, of course, all these guys were salivating over the free love. But they could pretend that they were above this kind of thing. So there I was reading about the beatniks every week. And it seemed to me that if anybody in the world was going to accept me, it might be perhaps the beatniks. And one summer my dad took us to Providence, Rhode Island. Not Providence, Rhode Island, it's Provincetown. Not realizing that Provincetown had become an artist colony. And I walked down the street in Provincetown one day, and I walked into a gallery, and the gallery owner and 4 of her friends in their 30s were having a spirited conversation. And I was 16. And I joined the spirited conversation. And they liked what I had to say so much that they kept me. And these were beatniks, genuine beatniks from Jane Street on the lower on the West Village.
Okay.
So that was my first taste of the beatniks. And when I was 16, I read On the Road, Jack Kerouac, and I decided I was going to drop out of high school in my junior year and was going to get a motorcycle and was going to drive across the country to California. There were only a couple of small problems. I didn't have any money to buy a motorcycle. The money I'd gotten for my bar mitzvah certainly wasn't going to cover it. I had no idea of how to ride a motorcycle, and I was the only kid my age in Buffalo, New York, without even a driver's license. Plus, I didn't have any money aside from the money from my bar mitzvah. But those problems didn't daunt me at all. However, my parents were so terrified that they got my literature teacher in high school to say, look, I'm not against your dropping out of school. I'll help you. We'll get you a berth at a lumber camp in Oregon. Now, do you think I wanted to spend my life imprisoned with a bunch of hairy guys smelling their armpit sweat?
Yeah, yeah.
So that alone discouraged me, and I dropped that idea. But then, when I was in college, I was at Reed College. That year, we had the highest median SATs of any school in the country, higher than Harvard, higher than Caltech, and higher than MIT. And I didn't know it. I was in the top 10% of my class. I didn't know it because they didn't give you grades at Reed. That was one of the selling points of the school. They kept them private so that they could help you get into grad school, and that was it. And I wanted to find Zen Buddhist Satori, which is what I've been after when I was 16 years old. So I dropped out of school to find Zen Buddhist Satori 8 weeks before the end of the first year. And I hitchhiked up and down the West Coast with two friends looking for the beatniks because they'd accepted me once. I thought they would accept me again. And according to all those articles in Time magazine, Beatnik Central was San Francisco. And it was the City Lights. It was the City Lights bookshop, which was owned by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, one of the greatest poets of the Beat era. So I hitchhiked from Portland, Oregon, actually from Seattle, down to San Francisco, and I went to the City Lights bookshop, and the place was empty, and there was one person behind the counter, and I said, where are the beatniks? And he didn't even look up from what he was reading, and he didn't answer me. So I walked out of the place because it was empty, completely confused again. And again, a kind person walking down the sidewalk said, you look disturbed about something. Can I help you? The kindness of people is remarkable. And I said, yes, I'm looking for the beatniks. And he rolled his eyes up into his head, and he scratched his forehead, and he thought really, really hard. And then he said, well, have you tried Colorado? And that was a little bit too much of an indefinite destination for me, and I gave up on finding the beatniks. But what was happening was other people were following me.
Okay.
They were following me and my two friends. And we ended up as somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen people living in a big pink condemned house in Berkeley, 3 blocks away from the Berkeley campus. Living naked all the time, no clothes. Having no clothes became so natural to us that it really became very, very hard to remind ourselves that we had to put on clothes to go to the grocery store. And one day, there was a person living on the second floor of this big pink condemned house, and he had a party and invited us, and we all went as we were, totally naked. And very quickly, the room we were in emptied out. And all of the party goers ended up in another room, and they sent an emissary to say, please go back where you came from. This is not appropriate for this party. So we went back downstairs. And people were dropping out of school to be part of us, to be with us. 2 kids drove I don't know how they heard about us. There was no internet in those days. There was no social media. But 2 kids in Virginia heard about us, dropped out of the University of Virginia, got into a little red MG and a little red British sports car, and drove all the way across the country to find us, and they did. So we were the nucleus of a movement. There were probably others that were nuclei of this movement too, and it was a movement without a name. And then I left the country for a year and lived on a kibbutz for 12 months, and came back after 13 months to the United States and saw that Time Life magazine, which had given me the beatniks, had given a name to our movement. They called it the hippie movement. So
Okay.
Right. So I actually did help accidentally start the 60s.
Which again is absolutely amazing. The scope of American history that you've participated in is just truly remarkable, And again, that's one of the things that makes it such an honor to be able to interview.
Well, and now I've been working with Buzz Aldrin. He's been a friend for 15 years. I worked with Edgar Mitchell, who was very supportive of me. I worked with the 11th president of India on harvesting solar power in space. I'm a Democrat. I'm working with Newt Gingrich. One of the projects that we're working on made Time Magazine, Newsweek, and CBS, NBC, and Fox News back in September. And now I'm bringing the former governor of New York State into that group because he, like I, wants to work across the aisle. And so things keep happening. It's not over yet. Nowhere near it.
Oh no, yeah, I can absolutely imagine. And again, you've written a lot of books, and I know that you actually wrote a book that's let me see, The God Problem, right? And so that seems like maybe it touches on the ecstatic thing, but it would also be interesting to have a book that maybe is completely focused on what you talked about, the ecstatic.
Well, I did write a book about the ecstatic experience. It's called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul and the Power Bits of Rock and Roll. And it's all of these amazing adventures with people like Bob Marley and Bette Midler and a whole bunch of others, but mostly Michael Jackson, who's the most important and astonishing and life-changing person I've ever met in my life, and who can literally expand the perceptual envelope of humanity if we understand him properly. And I've been getting the message from things like the Michael Jackson Book Club, which had me in a 2-hour interview a few days ago, that yes, I have managed to succeed in getting across who Michael really was. Because if you understand who Michael really was, he took the first principle of science, the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and the second principle of science, look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, to lengths I had never imagined in my life. He was the living incarnation of commitment to your audience. That's the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and of awe. He could see the infinite in the tiniest of things, and to be standing next to him as his knees buckled and feel his knees buckling with your knees was one of the most astonishing experiences of my entire life, and was a fulfillment of everything I had been looking for since the age of 10.
Amazing. Well, I think we're all set for today. So I will put all of this together. And now, is your new book available on Amazon? Can I get a link for that?
It's available on Amazon. It's available on Barnes and Noble, and it's available on bookstore.org. Unfortunately, real bookstores that you can walk into don't exist right now because of the COVID, the coronavirus problem. But Amazon is it.
Thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough.
Have a good evening.